Nearly 2000 years ago, in the ancient city of Jerusalem, Jesus of Nazareth sat down for a final meal with his closest followers. They did not fully understand what was about to happen. Within hours, one of them would betray him, another would deny even knowing him. His followers would scatter. He would be arrested in the darkness, questioned through the night, handed over to Roman authority, mocked, beaten, and condemned to death. And before the next day was over, Jesus would be hanging on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem. These were the final hours before his death, hours filled with betrayal, fear, violence, suffering, and extraordinary words of forgiveness. But to understand what Jesus endured, we have to return to Jerusalem, to the night before the crucifixion. Jerusalem was crowded. It was Passover. Jewish pilgrims had traveled from different regions to worship in the holy city, and the streets would have been filled with visitors. For the Roman authorities, large religious gatherings could also bring tension. Rome controlled Judea. Roman soldiers were present. Pontius Pilate governed the region under Roman authority. And somewhere inside this crowded city, Jesus gathered with his disciples for a meal. The disciples had followed him across Galilee and Judea. They had watched him teach crowds. They had seen the sick healed. They had witnessed confrontations with religious leaders. Some believed they were watching the beginning of something extraordinary. But during this meal, Jesus began speaking about departure, betrayal, and death. The mood changed. According to the Gospel accounts, Jesus told his disciples that one of them would betray him. The men began questioning who it could be. One of those sitting with them was Judas Iscariot, a disciple, a man who had traveled with Jesus, a man who had heard his teachings firsthand. And yet, Judas had already set betrayal in motion. The Gospel of Matthew says Judas had approached the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" They counted out 30 pieces of silver. Now the moment was approaching. During the meal, Jesus took bread. He gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. He told them, "This is my body." Then he took the cup and spoke of his blood being poured out. For Christians, this moment would become one of the most remembered acts of the Last Supper. But Jesus did something else that night, something shocking in the social world of his disciples. He washed their feet. Foot washing was the work associated with humble service. Yet Jesus knelt before his followers and washed them one by one. The teacher served his students. The one they called Lord took the position of a servant, and he told them to follow his example. But the night was growing darker. Judas eventually left. John's Gospel describes the moment with a hauntingly simple line, "And it was night." Jesus knew his disciples were about to face fear and confusion, so he spoke to them. He told them not to let their hearts be troubled. He spoke about love. He spoke about the Holy Spirit. He told them they would experience sorrow, and he warned Peter that before the rooster crowed, Peter would deny him 3 times. Peter could hardly imagine it. He insisted he was prepared to follow Jesus even to death. Within hours, that confidence would collapse. After the meal, Jesus and his disciples left for the Mount of Olives. They were walking toward Gethsemane and toward the beginning of the end. Outside the crowded city, near the Mount of Olives, was a place called Gethsemane. Jesus entered the garden area with his disciples. Then he took Peter, James, and John farther with him. The Gospel accounts describe a dramatic change. Jesus was deeply distressed. He told them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He asked them to remain there and keep watch. Then Jesus moved away and prayed. This is one of the most emotionally intense moments recorded in the Gospels. Jesus knew what was approaching: arrest, humiliation, pain, and death. He prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Luke describes his anguish as so intense that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Whether understood as descriptive imagery or connected by some commentators to a rare stress-related medical phenomenon, the Gospel's central point is unmistakable. Jesus was in profound anguish. He returned to his disciples. They were sleeping. He woke them. He returned to prayer, Again, they struggled to stay awake. Jesus was preparing to face what was coming. His friends could barely keep their eyes open. And then the silence of Gethsemane was interrupted. People were approaching. Torches could be seen in the darkness. Weapons were being carried, and leading them toward Jesus was Judas. Judas approached Jesus and greeted him with a kiss. A gesture normally associated with friendship became the signal identifying the man they had come to arrest. Jesus said, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" Everything happened quickly. The disciples realized what was happening. Peter drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. But Jesus stopped the violence. Luke records that Jesus touched the man's ear and healed him. Even while being arrested, Jesus responded to violence with healing. Then he was taken. The disciples fled. Think about the transformation of only a few hours. At dinner, Jesus had been surrounded by friends. Now Judas had betrayed him. His disciples had scattered, and Jesus was being led away under guard. The night was far from over. The Gospel accounts describe Jesus being brought before Jewish religious authorities, including the high priest. Witnesses were brought forward. Accusations were made. Questions were asked about his identity and his claims. The proceedings described across the four Gospels contain different details and emphases, but they converge on a central reality. Jesus was now in the hands of those seeking a case against him. Outside, Peter had followed at a distance. He entered a courtyard and warmed himself near a fire. Someone looked at him. "You also were with Jesus." Peter denied it. Another person recognized him. Again, Peter denied knowing Jesus. Then it happened a third time. Peter insisted he did not know the man they were talking about, and a rooster crowed. Luke records an unforgettable detail. Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Peter remembered the warning from only hours earlier. Before the rooster crowed, he would deny Jesus 3 times. Peter went outside and wept bitterly. The man who had promised to die beside Jesus had been overcome by fear. Meanwhile, Jesus remained in custody. Some of those guarding him mocked and struck him. They blindfolded him and demanded that he prophesy who had hit him. The humiliation had begun. But the Roman authorities controlled the power of crucifixion. So as morning arrived, Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea. The accusations brought before Roman authority focused on Jesus as a potential political threat. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "You have said so." John's Gospel records a longer exchange in which Jesus explains, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate eventually asked one of the most famous questions in the entire account: what is truth? The Gospel narratives portray Pilate as finding no sufficient basis for the accusations against Jesus. Yet, the pressure surrounding the case continued. Luke also describes Jesus being sent to Herod Antipas, who happened to be in Jerusalem. Herod wanted to see Jesus perform a sign. Jesus did not satisfy him. After mocking him, Herod's men sent Jesus back to Pilate. Pilate now faced a decision. A prisoner could be released. The crowd was offered a choice involving Jesus and Barabbas. Barabbas was associated with rebellion and violence. The crowd called for Barabbas, and for Jesus, crucify him. Pilate asked what crime Jesus had committed, but the cries continued, "Crucify him." Eventually, Pilate gave way. Jesus would be scourged, and Jesus would be crucified. Before crucifixion, Roman prisoners would be subjected to brutal scourging. The Gospels do not provide a clinical description of every wound Jesus received, so we should be careful not to invent details. What they do tell us is severe enough. Pilate had Jesus scourged. Roman soldiers then took him and turned his supposed kingship into a cruel performance. They dressed him in a robe. They twisted together a crown of thorns and placed it on his head. They mocked him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck him. They spat on him. They bowed before him in mock worship. Everything associated with royalty became an instrument of humiliation. A robe instead of royal clothing, thorns instead of a crown, mocking soldiers instead of loyal subjects. And after After the beating and humiliation, Jesus was brought out again. John records Pilate saying, "Behold the man." But the demands for crucifixion did not stop. The sentence stood. Jesus was handed over to be crucified. Jesus was led toward the place of execution. The Gospel of John says Jesus went out carrying the cross. The Synoptic Gospels tell us that along the way, Roman soldiers compelled a man named Simon of Cyrene to carry it. Simon had probably begun that day expecting nothing like this. Suddenly, his name became permanently connected to the final journey of Jesus. Women mourned as Jesus passed. According to Luke, Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." Even on the road to his execution, his words were directed toward others. Eventually, they reached the place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. The Romans were ready. Crucifixion was designed to do more than kill. It was public, humiliating, painful, and terrifying to anyone watching. Rome used crucifixion as an instrument of punishment and intimidation. Jesus was crucified between two others. Above him was placed an inscription identifying him as Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. People passed by. Some mocked him. Religious opponents mocked him. Even as he hung on the cross, the ridicule continued. And then Luke records extraordinary words. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Forgiveness, spoken from the cross. Nearby were people who loved him. John's Gospel places his mother near the cross, along with the disciple traditionally identified as John. Jesus looked toward them. He said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." In the middle of his suffering, Jesus was still thinking about someone else's care. One of the criminals crucified beside him mocked him. The other rebuked the first. Then he turned toward Jesus. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." A dying man asked to be remembered. Jesus answered with hope. The Gospels describe darkness coming over the land. Hours passed. Then came one of Jesus's most haunting cries, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These words echo the opening of Psalm 22, a psalm that begins in anguish and moves toward trust and vindication. Later, Jesus said, "I thirst." John says a sponge soaked in sour wine was lifted toward him. Then came another declaration, "It is finished." 3 words in English, but for Christians, they carry enormous meaning. Jesus was not simply describing the end of physical suffering. Christian theology has long understood this moment in connection with the completion of his saving mission. Luke records his final words, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Then Jesus died. The man who had entered Jerusalem only days earlier, surrounded by crowds, was dead on a Roman cross. The Gospel accounts describe remarkable events surrounding his death. Matthew says the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split. The tearing of the temple curtain became deeply significant in Christian interpretation, representing access to God through Christ. A Roman centurion, watching what happened, responded with astonishment. Mark records him saying, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Think about who makes this declaration. Not one of the 12, not someone who had followed Jesus through Galilee. A Roman centurion standing at an execution. The day that began with Jesus in custody was nearing its end. But there was another problem. The Sabbath was approaching. The bodies could not simply remain there indefinitely. John's Gospel says the soldiers came to ensure that those being crucified would die before the bodies were removed. The legs of the other crucified men were broken. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, one soldier pierced his side with a spear. John says, immediately blood and water came out. For the Gospel writer, these details mattered. Jesus had truly died. The crucifixion was over. Now his body had to be buried. The final hours of Jesus contain almost every form of human suffering. Betrayal by a friend, abandonment, false accusation, public humiliation, physical violence, fear, grief, and death. Yet throughout the gospel accounts, another pattern appears. When his disciples respond with violence, Jesus stops them. When his enemies attack him, he does not call his followers to revenge. From the cross, he speaks forgiveness. He comforts the criminal beside him. He makes provision for his mother, and he entrusts himself to the Father. This is one reason the crucifixion stands at the center of Christianity. Christians do not see the cross merely as the tragic death of a religious teacher. They believe something far greater was happening. The New Testament teaches that Jesus willingly gave his life for sinners. As the Gospel of John says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son." The cross therefore becomes a symbol of something that appears contradictory: suffering and love, judgment and mercy, death and the promise of life. As darkness approached Jerusalem, Jesus lay inside a tomb. His followers were devastated. His enemies believed the matter was finished. A stone stood between the living and the dead. But Christianity exists because his followers soon proclaimed something extraordinary. They said the tomb did not remain occupied. They said Jesus rose from the dead. And what happened next transformed a frightened group of disciples into people willing to carry his message far beyond Jerusalem, across nations, across languages, across generations. Until nearly 2000 years later, people around the world still speak his name. The final 24 hours of Jesus were filled with unimaginable suffering. But according to the Christian faith, Good Friday was not the end. Sunday was coming.